The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, as Jake and his friends pulled their shiny motorcycles into the dusty gas station off Route 66. Jake, the leader of the biker gang known as the Road Wolves, took off his helmet and shook out his long hair. His buddies, Axel and Tank, parked next to him, their engines roaring one last time before silence filled the air. "Man, this place looks dead," Axel said, eyeing the lonely gas station. The old signs squeaked in the wind, and the neon lights flickered weakly. Tank, the big, bearded guy of the group, laughed. "Perfect place for some fun," he said with a grin. The bikers swaggered into the gas station's convenience store, pushing open the glass door, which rang a tiny bell above. Behind the counter stood a young cashier named Jamie, who barely looked out of high school. His wide eyes glanced nervously at the bikers as they approached, but the Road Wolves didn't pay much attention to Jamie. Instead, their gaze shifted to the far corner of the store, where two men in camouflage uniforms were filling up baskets with snacks. These were no ordinary men. They were soldiers, and even though they looked relaxed, something about the way they moved was disciplined and sharp. One of the soldiers, a tall and lean guy with piercing blue eyes, noticed the bikers staring. He nodded politely and went back to choosing chips. His friend, a muscular guy with short hair and a confident smile, was busy checking out a map spread across the counter. Jake cracked his knuckles and nudged his friends. "Hey, look at these army boys, acting like they own the place," he said, his voice full of mischief. Axel grinned. "Let's show them who really owns the road around here," he replied. The three bikers sauntered over, making sure their boots stomped loudly against the floor. "Hey, soldier boys," Jake called out, his voice mocking. The tall, blue-eyed soldier looked up, calm but alert. "Something we can help you with?" he asked. "Yeah," Jake said, leaning in. "How about you leave your snacks and get out of our way?" Axel and Tank chuckled behind him, enjoying the tension. The soldiers exchanged a glance. The one with the map, who seemed to be the leader, folded it calmly and placed it in his pocket. His name tag read, Captain Reed. Captain Reed smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that said he had seen worse things than a group of rowdy bikers. "Sorry, gentlemen," Captain Reed replied. "We're just here to get some food for the road. No trouble needed." Tank stepped forward, towering over the soldiers. "Maybe you didn't hear our leader," he growled. "This is our spot." But before anyone could make another move, the old door of the gas station opened again. In walked a third soldier, a woman with short-cropped hair and a determined look on her face. Her name tag said Sergeant Black. She sized up the situation in one glance and joined her teammates. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice calm but with a hint of steel. Jake and his friends didn't back down. "Yeah, the problem is you army folks are disrespecting our turf," Jake sneered. Sergeant Black raised an eyebrow. "Disrespecting? We're just buying snacks." But she didn't look scared. In fact, there was a glint of amusement in her eyes. Captain Reed sighed and put his basket down. "Look," he said, "we don't want any trouble. But if you insist," his hand went to his belt, and that's when the bikers noticed something. These weren't just any soldiers. They had special patches on their uniforms, symbols that only belonged to elite military units. Tank suddenly felt a little less confident. Jake," he whispered. But Jake was too stubborn to notice. He moved in closer to Captain Reed. Just as the tension reached its peak, a loud bark interrupted them. Everyone turned to see a massive dog, a German shepherd, standing by the door. It belonged to the soldiers. The dog's name, Ranger, was stitched onto its vest, and it seemed to understand the situation perfectly. Ranger growled, making even the fearless road wolves pause. Sergeant Black smiled. "Ranger doesn't like bullies," she said, scratching the dog's head. "So, what's it gonna be?" Before Jake could decide, an old man's voice rang out from the counter. It was Mr. Jenkins, the owner of the gas station. "Enough of this nonsense," he shouted. "Take your drama outside, or I'm calling the sheriff." Everyone went quiet, except for Ranger, who let out one final, deep growl. The bikers hesitated, and Captain Reed folded his arms, waiting. Jake gritted his teeth, but finally took a step back. "This isn't over," he muttered. Axel and Tank followed, looking more defeated than they'd ever admit. They left the store and revved up their motorcycles, the engine sounding more like a retreat than a challenge. The soldiers watched them leave, and Captain Reed turned back to Sergeant Black. "Looks like we made some new friends," he said. Sergeant Black chuckled. "Yeah, friends who might come back for round 2, she replied. Ranger barked in agreement, as if ready for whatever came next. Jamie, the cashier, finally let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Thanks," he said, his voice shaking. "I thought I was going to have to call the cops." Captain Reed picked up his basket and smiled. "No worries. But if they do come back, let's hope they've learned their lesson." As the roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, a quiet settled over the gas station. Jamie, still shaken, tried to steady his hands as he rang up the soldiers' snacks. "You guys are like action heroes," he said, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief. Captain Reed chuckled, picking up his change. "Just doing our part to keep the peace," he replied. But his calm expression hinted at something deeper, something he wasn't sharing. Sergeant Black glanced out the window, her eyes narrowing as she watched the dust settle on the road. "They'll be back," she said, almost as if she could see the road wolves plotting their next move. "Guys like that don't just give up." The third soldier, the tall one with blue eyes, named Corporal Hayes, spoke up. "We should be prepared," he said. "I don't trust them, especially after that look Jake gave us." Captain Reed nodded, his mind already forming a plan. "Good thinking, Hayes," he said. "But let's not draw attention. We'll be gone soon enough." The soldiers paid for their snacks, thanked Jamie, and made their way outside. Ranger, the loyal German shepherd, followed closely behind, sniffing the air as if sensing something strange. The soldiers began loading their supplies into an olive-green military SUV parked at one of the gas pumps. The vehicle, strong and rugged, was built to handle any terrain, but at this moment, it seemed too peaceful. Sergeant Black suddenly spotted something in the distance. A glint of metal flashed between the trees lining the road. "Reed," she called out, her voice low and serious. "We've got company." Sure enough, the bikers were back, but this time they weren't just looking for trouble. They had called in reinforcements. 6 more motorcycles roared down the road, each one carrying a leather-clad rider with tattoos and determined scowls. At the front of the group was Jake, a smirk on his face and a plan for revenge gleaming in his eyes. "Oh, great," Corporal Hayes muttered. "Now it's a party." The road wolves rolled up to the gas station, surrounding the soldiers and their SUV in a semicircle. Jake dismounted his bike and took off his helmet, his eyes burning with defiance. "Told you this wasn't over," he said, his voice loud enough to echo off the old gas pumps. Captain Reed, still calm, stepped forward. "This isn't smart," he said, his tone steady. "You're outnumbered and outmatched." Jake laughed, but it was a humorless sound. "Outnumbered? Looks like we've got you boxed in, army man." Sergeant Black looked over at Ranger, who was watching the bikers carefully, ears perked up. "Well, Jake," she said, folding her arms, "before you make any moves, you should know one thing." Jake tilted his head, amused. "Oh yeah? And what's that?" Black's eyes glinted with a mischievous sparkle. "We're not just any soldiers. We're on special assignment." The bikers exchanged glances, uncertain but unwilling to back down. Jake held his ground. "Special assignment?" he scoffed. "What are you, secret agents or something?" Corporal Hayes smirked, and Captain Reed took a step forward. "Something like that," he said. "And if you knew what we were carrying, you'd probably think twice about picking this fight." Jake's eyes narrowed. He wasn't buying it. "I don't care what you're carrying," he spat. "This is our turf, and you've disrespected us." Tank, Jake's biggest and most intimidating friend, cracked his knuckles and moved closer. "Let's show him what happens to people who cross the road wolves," he growled. But before things could get ugly, a surprising sound broke through the tension. The whirring of helicopter blades. Everyone turned to look as a black military chopper appeared on the horizon, flying low and fast. It was heading straight for the gas station. "What the?" Jake started, but he never got to finish his sentence. The helicopter swooped in, landing with a rush of wind that sent dust and loose debris flying everywhere. The bikers shielded their eyes as the chopper's rotors slowed, and 2 more soldiers jumped out, each wearing tactical gear. "Captain Reed," one of them called, "we've got the package secured. Ready for extraction." The bikers stared, their confidence wavering. Captain Reed gave Jake a knowing smile. "Told you we were on a special assignment," he said. "Now, unless you want to escalate this into a situation that involves the full force of the U.S. military, I suggest you leave." Jake looked from the helicopter to the soldiers, his bravado crumbling. He had never planned for this. Axel and Tank shifted uncomfortably, no longer eager for a fight. Sergeant Black leaned in, her voice dangerously soft. "Last chance, boys. Leave, or things get serious." For a long moment, Jake stood there, his pride battling with common sense. Finally, he clenched his jaw and spat on the ground. "This isn't over," he muttered. Then he climbed back onto his bike, motioning for his gang to follow. The road wolves sped off, their engines roaring in frustration. But even as they disappeared into the fading daylight, Jake's words lingered in the air. "This isn't over." Captain Reed watched them go, his face thoughtful. "Something tells me we haven't seen the last of those guys," he said. Sergeant Black nodded, her hand resting on Ranger's head. "They'll be back," she agreed. "And next time, they might bring more than just their bikes." Corporal Hayes sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Great," he said. "Just what we needed. A biker gang with a grudge." The soldiers exchanged glances, knowing that their mission had just become more complicated. As the helicopter prepared to take off and the last of the sunset slipped behind the mountains, they braced themselves for whatever was coming next. Little did they know, the road wolves were already planning their revenge, and this sleepy gas station was about to become the stage for an epic showdown that no one would ever forget. A week passed since the intense standoff at the gas station, but the soldiers hadn't let their guard down. They had set up a temporary camp in the hills nearby, staying alert for any sign of the road wolves. Captain Reed, Sergeant Black, Corporal Hayes, and their loyal dog ranger remained vigilant, knowing that Jake and his gang wouldn't back off so easily. The night sky was clear, a blanket of stars stretching endlessly above. The soldiers sat around a small, controlled fire, their shadows dancing on the rocky ground. Ranger lay by the flames, his ears twitching at every distant sound. "We should be hearing from HQ soon," Corporal Hayes said, staring into the fire. "They promised an extraction point in 24 hours. Sergeant Black added, "Let's just hope the bikers aren't planning a farewell party for us." As if on cue, Ranger suddenly sat up, ears pointed toward the darkness. A low growl rumbled from his chest. The soldiers tensed, exchanging wary looks. Captain Reed grabbed his radio and whispered, "This is Eagle Team 1. We may have company. Stand by." Moments later, the sound of engines broke the quiet of the night. It was a full-scale invasion. The road wolves had returned, and this time, they had brought reinforcements. Dozens of bikes roared up the winding hill road, headlights cutting through the darkness like angry eyes. Jake led the charge, his face twisted in determination. His gang had prepared for this. They had bats, chains, and even a few firearms. This was no longer a simple grudge match. It had turned into a full-on showdown. Captain Reed stood up, his eyes narrowing. "Get ready, team," he said. "They're coming for us." The bikers surrounded the camp, engines rumbling like thunder. Jake dismounted, glaring at the soldiers with a wicked grin. "Told you this wasn't over," he snarled. Captain Reed remained calm, even as the tension crackled in the air. "You're making a mistake, Jake," he said. "We're on official duty, and if you push this, you'll regret it." Jake raised his hand, and his gang revved their engines, a show of power meant to intimidate. But the soldiers didn't back down. They stood together, weapons at the ready, Ranger growling at their side. Before Jake could give the order to attack, a blinding spotlight suddenly illuminated the entire hillside. Everyone froze as a booming voice echoed from above. "This is the U.S. Army. Stand down immediately." Two massive military helicopters hovered overhead, their searchlights cutting through the night. Soldiers in full tactical gear rappelled down ropes, surrounding the area. More military vehicles arrived, headlights blazing and engines roaring. Jake's confidence shattered. The road wolves found themselves completely outmatched. They had expected a fight with a few soldiers, not a full-blown military operation. Jake's hands trembled as he realized the gravity of the situation. A stern-looking general emerged from one of the armored vehicles, his voice commanding, "Biker gang, you are all under arrest for attempting to interfere with a classified military operation. Drop your weapons and surrender now." Jake and his gang had no choice. One by one, they dropped their weapons and raised their hands in defeat. The soldiers moved in quickly, securing the bikers and confiscating their gear. Captain Reed watched as the chaos settled into calm. He approached Jake, who now looked more like a scared boy than a fearsome gang leader. "Told you this was a bad idea," Reed said quietly. "Some fights just aren't worth it." Jake didn't reply. He just hung his head as the soldiers led him and his gang away. With the road wolves neutralized, Captain Reed and his team finally breathed a sigh of relief. The general approached them, a proud smile on his face. "Well done, Eagle Team," he said. "You held your ground long enough for reinforcements to arrive." "Mission accomplished." Sergeant Black grinned. "Just another day on the job," she said, patting Ranger, who barked happily, his tail wagging. As the helicopters lifted off and the soldiers prepared to leave, Corporal Hayes looked at the sky, which was beginning to brighten with the first hints of dawn. "Think we'll get any more trouble out here?" he asked. Captain Reed shook his head, a smile playing on his lips. "Not after this," he replied. "I think we've shown them that messing with the wrong soldiers is never a good idea." The team packed up, ready for their next mission, knowing that no challenge was too great as long as they had each other and Ranger by their side. The sun rose, casting golden light over the hills, signaling a new day and the end of an adventure that would be told and retold in stories for years to come.